Welcome to the Magnificast. This is a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean, a Catholic PhD student in philosophy at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto, where I research media and religion, and write as a journalist, and hang out with my cats, and work at a coffee shop and a comic book shop, and that's what I'm about. That's what I do.
I'm Matt. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois. My research interests are media archaeology, cultural theory, Christianity, leftist politics, and watching the movie Trolls over and over again. That's what my new research interest is. I've seen Trolls about every day in the past 2 weeks, and let me tell you, it's good.
Independent of your son's desires, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's right. Every day he comes home from daycare and he just says, "I want to watch Trolls," and we do.
Nice. Does he have troll hair yet? Like, is that a thing?
Not yet, but it's coming.
It's Halloween's coming up. I mean, it's a perfect costume for a tiny child.
Yeah, that is a good point. You know what the worst part about Trolls is that the second Trolls movie, Trolls 2, doesn't come out until 2020. So I'm going to be stuck watching Trolls 1 for the next 3 years.
What's so good about it?
I don't know. Well, I mean, he likes it because I don't know exactly why he likes it. There are lots of songs in it. I think he's really into the songs. Okay. But it's a great story about making your enemies your friends, and I guess that's what it's all about.
Do they reconcile with, like, I don't know? I don't even know who troll enemies are. Do they have like a Gargamel figure?
Yeah, they do. It's very Smurfs-esque if you start thinking about it. So they're the trolls, and they live in a tree, and they're trolls not like mean trolls, but they're trolls like the little toy trolls from the 90s. They live in a tree, and there are these other kind of class of ugly-looking guys named Bergens who are always after them, trying to eat them. The Bergens think that the only way they can truly be happy is if they eat a troll, but by the end of the movie, they find out that the only way you can be happy is if you overthrow capitalism. And
good.
And they kind of come to terms with that, and they live in this sort of like troll Bergen utopia after that happens. Nice. They do actually not overthrow capitalism, but it's too bad. They should.
Yeah, Trolls 2 is just the slow decline of the revolutionary government.
Yeah, at the very end of Trolls, one of the main character trolls becomes the new queen troll, and I think that's really bad. I hate when movies teach your children that monarchy is good. It's not great. No,
it's bad even, I would say.
Speaking about overthrowing governments and trolls, this is the month of October. This is Red October, when all that good revolutionary energy is coming back to haunt us. So I thought, instead of reading an iTunes review this week, because we don't have any, we could take together, Dean, the political compass quiz, Who Are You, in 1917. This is a pretty good. I'm a big fan of any political compass quiz, mostly because they're super absurd and not accurate. But this one is very accurate, I think. So this is a political compass quiz that you have to answer questions about Russia in 1917, and it tells you where you are on that political spectrum. So you could be a Bolshevik, a left socialist revolutionary, an anarchist, a Menshevik. You could be part of the Black Hundreds. You could be in the cadets, any of those places. So Dean and I took it, and we're going to share our answers with you right now, so you know exactly where we stand in this revolutionary moment, this world historical event. So Dean, where are you at?
It's funny because I took this quiz, or the compass test, whatever, a year ago, and I was a left SR back then. But taking it today, I am now a Bolshevik. Just like my little like red circle migrated a hair's breadth north, which puts me apparently in Bolshevik territory. So yeah, I'm like on the compass here. I'm 2 squares over from the left SRs, and then my circle is just like hovering between the Bolshevik and left SR territories there.
That sounds pretty good, though. I mean, that sounds like a good place to be, right? Like, you're in that bottom left quadrant where all that good left communist stuff is happening.
That's right.
I mean, that makes sense, though. I mean, you're a part of the Communist Party of Canada now. Of course, you probably moved a little bit more to the authoritarian side.
I'm not officially part of the Communist Party of Canada yet.
Dang.
I'm like,
Okay.
They text me and ask me when I'm going to join, and then I'm like, probably soon. That's where I'm at with them.
So they're still just courting you, trying to get you to get on board, huh?
Yeah, I just need to be romanced a little bit by the Revolutionary Party. That's all. It's not too much to ask. Like a little bit of wine and dining. They did meet me for coffee, so that's basically wining and dining. Actually, if you're a leftist,
I think so.
What about you, Matt? Where are you at?
Okay, so I got left SRs, so feel good about that. That's
Nice.
the same answer I got last year. So I'm glad that I haven't really changed any.
You can always take comfort in that.
Yeah. But let's see. So left SRs, that's the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party. They're a little bit more, I don't know, towards the Democratic end of the spectrum. So my little red dot, though, is one entire box to the left and also one entire box down. So I'm more left and more
nice.
Democratic than even the left SRs.
Nice. So you went south and I went north.
Yeah, it's weird though. I'm further left than the left SRs or the anarchists. So
Right?
that's a thing.
I guess.
Yeah, I mean that sounds cool to
how
me,
would
though.
they determine that? What would make you more left, say, than the anarchists in a situation like this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess whatever answer I gave to some of those questions must have been that.
There was one bubble, and it was just like, yep, this guy's going left.
This guy is real weird to the left. So I was kind of thinking, like, I don't know. I was trying to think about this political compass test and then, like, the actual political compass test and, like, if they're that different. The actual political compass test is, like, way more questions, and they're way different questions. But I'm actually in the same exact spot in both of these charts. So that's interesting.
Nice.
Yeah.
That is interesting. You can apparently compare your responses here with all the other responses from the other revolutionary groups or whatever. So maybe you can find out after all where you're at on that that left of the anarchism problem.
So something I like to do in some of my classes when we talk about politics, it's not like super revealing or anything, and it's not even like a great way to think about politics, but something I like to do is show them the political compass test and show them like where the Democrats are and where the Republicans are, because
Nice.
that's a pretty I don't know, right? It tells you something really interesting about politics, that basically they're the same.
Yeah.
So, if you compare the political compass test from the 2016 election to the 1917 Russian Revolution one, you see some really interesting confluences of ideology here. So, okay, you and I are both on the left, and that's not surprising. But let's see. Trump, Bush, Cruz, Rubio are all basically the Black Hundreds. And Hillary Clinton is, the cadet party. So that is not surprising, but actually very funny to make those types of connections.
Yeah, it is very funny.
Yeah, that the entire Republican Party are basically in the fascist territory is like, I don't know. I'm not surprised.
I like that. I also like that on this compass, the cadets are like just slightly further right than the Black Hundreds, even though they're not as authoritarian.
Right, but and they're the liberals. Okay, I mean they'll get you. I don't know. Gotta stay away from that entire right side of the political compass is just extremely bad.
Yeah, real bad news over there.
Yeah. Cool. Well, this week on the Magnificast, we're talking with Jonathan Murden about about Orthodoxy in general and the legacy of the Orthodox Church in the Russian Revolution. He has some really interesting historical points to say about that. That'll give some breadth to the discussions we've had about Lenin and religion. A little bit of a different take on things. So let's go over to Jonathan.
I have really enjoyed hanging out with you on Twitter, so it's nice to put a voice to the Twitter avatar. Maybe we could just start out, what are you up to? What are you doing these days?
So I'm an undergraduate in theology. I'm currently on a year abroad in the Czech Republic. I'm studying in Prague. I'm studying various things, bits of Orthodox theology, bits of media theory. one module in art history. It's a year abroad, so kind of taking the opportunity to just kind of do different stuff. What else am I up to? I don't know. Apart, that's pretty much the biggest thing happening in my life right now, really. So
it's a pretty big thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really neat. I never got to study abroad well, I did for my PhD, but not for other stuff. So it sounds like a cool opportunity.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. I've only been here a few weeks, but I like it. So hopefully I'll get a hang of it a bit. Get the hang of the language a bit better over time. Hopefully, we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds tough. Matt, what have you been doing?
Man, same stuff as last week. My report's never very fun. It's just like I'm always just like grading some papers, and getting depressed about whatever. Last night, okay, so here's the thing that I can tell you. So I teach at a Christian school, and that's a thing. And this one class I'm teaching is like this seminar for seniors, and like every senior in any discipline, the arts and sciences, have to take this class. And they had to write this paper called a Christian thought paper, so that we could kind of like faculty could like look at them and compare them with like other sort of theological documents that students have written, and we can see, I don't know, what we've done to them, like for better or for worse. And I don't know, I was reading through them last night, and they're mostly, I don't know, like what you'd expect, like very, very pious kind of things about the importance of Jesus in their life, and I don't know, that's fine. But one student particularly wrote this paper. I don't know, he must have knew, my brand must precede me, because he was writing about Christian transhumanism and robots, and he even made a nod towards object-oriented ontology, and I was like really interested. It was like super weird. Like he must have like researched who I was and like what my interests were before he wrote the paper, because they were like all things I really wanted to read about.
That's awesome.
So that was really fun. It's nice to get like a really weird paper and just enjoy it. It breaks up the monotony that is grading.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's great. Fun stuff. What are you doing, Dean?
On Saturday, I am gonna go to Portland, Oregon, to visit some friends. So this week I'm like crunching everything into the last few days. So it's, I don't know, it's like stressful, but also pretty soon I'm gonna be not here and on vacation. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah,
you deserve it.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. It's hard, not everybody recognizes it, so it's nice to just have somebody say it sometimes,
Yeah. Are you going to go to the Tony Hawk Pro Skater Portland skate park?
I would love to do that, but I think I left all my tech decks at my mom's house, so I don't think I could like earn that kind of street cred.
Yeah, well, find those secret tapes,
That's right. So, Jonathan, I don't know if you've heard lately, but we've become a master at segues, and this is just one more example. Because here we are just brutally transitioning right into the next part of this podcast.
It's seamless. No one can even tell.
There's no seams. We're not even sewing this up in post. We were on this podcast a while ago called Revolutionary Left Radio, and they think a lot harder about their podcast than we do, which is nice. One cool thing that they do is they asked us to just talk a little bit about our like religious and political commitments, and we're going to ask you to do that as well. So for folks who don't know what you're up to, what your deal is, maybe give them a short little autobiographical sketch.
Okay, I grew up in a kind of charismatic evangelical household, Labour voting, so like left-leaning. And I left that when I came to university, and I converted to Orthodoxy. I've been a member of the Orthodox Church for around. I've been attending services for around 2 years now. I've been like an actual, charismated member of the church since a year ago on Easter. I was kind of similar to my family, kind of Labour supporter for a while, and kind of over the summer before I left for uni, actually, I began moving further left. There was a series of events, kind of there was a general election here, and then there was a kind of the European refugee crisis, and those began to push me further left. I kind of fell under the influence of the anarchist left, which in England, if you're not if you're moving to the left of the Labour Party, you end up with the anarchists, really. But I don't know if I would call myself that now. I don't know. I'm certainly a communist of some kind, but I'm not 100% sure of anything exact tendency past that. And anarchist leanings.
That's cool. Anarchist leanings are very good.
Yeah, I like to think so.
I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to say very good. Anarchist leanings are stupendous, I think.
Yeah, we have our thesaurus open next to us right now.
It's part of your brand now. You can't abandon it. How would we know? The Magnificast.
It's true. There's two strategies here. One is to take the advice of people that actually listen to this and give them what they want. The other is to just double down on what we're already doing, and I think that's probably what's going to happen. That sounds very good to me.
Jonathan, so that's cool though that you're a member of the Orthodox Church and also a leftist of some variety. I mean, I don't know. That's kind of where I think Dean and I find ourselves a lot of times too. But I think you're the first Orthodox person on this show, so that's very cool.
Yeah.
First one who was willing to say so, anyway. So.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I don't know. There's certainly not. I couldn't comment on how many Orthodox people there are on the left. There's certainly not really a kind of left Orthodox movement. I think Orthodoxy, like most churches, it kind of has most people are somewhere between on the kind of liberal reactionary spectrum. But I think that's pretty common in churches. The difference is just in Orthodoxy, the reactionary side can be quite pronounced. That's not a different side either, I guess, actually thinking about it. Yeah, no, I think, finding there's not really a left Orthodox movement as such, so right. I don't
know. One reason we wanted to chat with you a bit in particular, especially during October, is I feel like it's interesting to talk to Orthodox Christians about the history of the left because, they had an interesting kind of intertwined narrative in the 20th century with Leninism and Russian communism. So we can get into that in a little bit, but maybe to start out, could you just say something about what it's been like for you to find yourself kind of newly adopting like an Orthodox community and a leftist community, or being adopted by them, however you want to put that? What's that been like trying to hold those two things together? Is it in tension? Do you run into weird interactions with other people in your churches, or do you find it's more natural than you would have expected? Like, I'm just very curious because I've never, I'm not Orthodox, and I actually don't know that many people who are. So I've always been curious about what Orthodox people think about communism these days.
Yeah, it hasn't come up that much. I tend to not talk about politics in mixed company, just because I have very strong opinions about everything, and so. If politics comes up, I tend to try and avoid it just because I'd rather not spend all my time with other people arguing. It has come up occasionally. I remember one time. This is an example of a kind of maybe average reaction in that I was in a bar with some friends and it got into politics, and I said that I was probably to the left of the Labour Party, and they said, "You mean like a communist?" And I said, "Well, yes." To which their eyes go wide, and one of them said to me, "So, Jonathan, do you persecute yourself, or do you ask other people to persecute you?" He was joking, but he also, I think, kind of did mean that. I think people do. I mean, the other person said that explains a lot, actually. So, I think reactions are different. I've never had like an unequivocally positive reaction. But again, I think I wonder if that would be the case if in any other church either. Really, I don't know. It's not been an issue because mostly I just kind of go to church on Sunday and the other things that I go to with church stuff, and then I go to the meetings that I've been to for organising stuff on like Wednesdays or the other days or whatever, and they don't really. The two worlds are kind of I mean, it's unfortunate they're separate, but they are in many ways separate worlds, which makes my life slightly easier. It also helps that in Durham, the left-wing community, both the Orthodox community and the left-wing community, I'm at uni in Durham normally, and both communities are very small. So it's not become like a major issue at any point.
Right. I'm just thinking too a little bit about what it must be like to be Orthodox even in the UK. It seems like that would be a lot different than being Orthodox in the Czech Republic, for example. What drew you to that expression and tradition, and how's that been playing out for you?
I was drawn to it because of, I think a lot of people who grow up evangelical find it insufficient for kind of sustaining them in a healthy way. My background particularly was quite damaging for me in a lot of ways, and so I needed to get out of that in some way. And in some ways I kind of fell accidentally into Orthodoxy, but equally I kind of I found a combination of kind of descriptive factors. So I felt that just to acknowledge that to do theology well, you need a tradition, or that to acknowledge that to kind of live healthily, you need a community, like to recognize like your place in the community. Those kind of things I felt were kind of descriptive, as in that's kind of what any healthy Christian community will look like, and it's better that we are honest about that so we can think about it. And there's also the prescriptive level, which is kind of how things should be. And for me, there's, I mean, talking about exactly what it is that draws you over a period of time is difficult, but kind of sacraments, kind of the salvation as life in the church, a union with Christ. There's a significance given to materiality that I hadn't felt in other theologies that I'd encountered, a kind of sense that materiality does kind of make a difference in the spiritual life, and needs to be kind of talked about, taken into account. Yeah, I could talk more, but I don't know how much.
No, that all makes sense, and definitely, like, I feel like I get it. So I'm a Protestant, and the Orthodox Church, I mean the Catholic Church too, but the Orthodox Church specifically, I've been to two in my entire life, only two, and they've always been incredibly appealing to me. And I think they've been so appealing to me just because of like the sort of like harsh contradiction that you feel like when you're in one, that it's just like so different than a Protestant church, and that difference is a difference that makes a difference, to be sure. Like, okay, I want to say this, but it might come off a little bit like, I don't know, weird. I hope it won't. Okay, so like here's what I'm thinking. Like, the Orthodox Church is so cool because there's like actually lots of like weird kind of practices that kind of jar you out of your everyday life, like lots of different rituals that don't make sense unless you're kind of a part of that community. So like making that, like coming in from sort of weird Protestant world into the Orthodox Church is cool because there's like way more mystery involved in the church than like you're maybe used to. Like, yeah, there's like a big screen that you can't see behind, and there's like, you know, chalices and all kinds of like other stuff going on, whereas like in the normal Protestant church it's like you know, whitewashed walls and a video projector. And they like, the aesthetic is so good, and it's pretty powerful, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely right. I think on commenting on what you said about it being so weird, is that I think that almost all churches are kind of weird in their own way. I don't think that's bad. I'm an extremely weird person anyway. But I think that often, at least the churches I grew up in, they would try and pretend they weren't weird. The whole point was, this is, you know, you can, I mean, you guys both been in youth clubs, and you know, the whole thing is, you know, you can follow Jesus, still be cool. Which, like, I guess, but also when you're emphasizing that so much, there's a bit of a jar between how actually completely weird it is. So it's kind of refreshing to be somewhere where, you know, every week we go and kiss a lot of pictures and eat blood, and I don't know, you know what I mean? Like,
maybe weird isn't the best description here. Like what I'm thinking about though is that there's like, in the Orthodox Church, there's like a real majesty and mystery to the entire experience,
Right.
where like Protestant churches are just like, I don't know, boring.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think that there's definitely a sense in which in Orthodoxy there's a recognition of the ascetic as not being merely ascetic. That actually that actually, you know, what things look like, or a kind of what you might think of as purely matters of image, do actually do something. They're not merely for show or for illustration, or and this links back to what I was saying about materiality, in that the classic example given is obviously the theology of the icon. And when you go into Orthodox churches, the icons are the most obvious thing. They're kind of everywhere. And the icons were at one point very controversial. There was a big controversy in I think the 600s. My church history isn't always the best, but you know, early. And the theology justifying the use of icons is that because Christ was human and took a body, we can depict him using immaterial form, which is why originally there were prohibitions on depicting the Father. You couldn't depict the Father, but you could depict the Son, you could depict the saints, and these depictions do in some sense mediate the presence of the one depicted. The one depicted is in some sense made presence by the image of them. And that sense in which the ritual of the church, the kind of and the materiality of that ritual is in some sense a mediation, is not something that you find acknowledged in Protestantism. It's often attempted to deny, although I might suggest that denial is perhaps dishonest.
Well, sorry, you said the whole thing about the images, and now my media studies senses are tingling. So can you talk about that mediation? Because that's super interesting to me. How is presence mediated, or how is that understood, I guess, in worship?
So there's a particular understanding of how an image works, and it's such that when you depict something, it's not merely a kind of how to explain this best. If you have a photo in your wallet of someone, that's not merely a kind of that's not merely something exterior to that person that you have. That's not something merely exterior. That in some sense does, for you, when you look at that picture, you are in some sense interacting with that person. Obviously, it's not the same as if the person were there. If it's not the same as if the person were there in person, we would say the hypostasis of the person isn't present themselves, but in some sense, the image does participate in them, and it mediates them in a degree. And I precisely use the image of the wallet because I would suggest that this is a property. There's not something magical to icons specifically. This is something that all images. This is something about the nature of images depicting something. This is what depicting something does. Depicting makes present sense, and therefore, when you depict Christ or a holy person, you are in some sense making them present.
That sounds... Sorry, I don't mean to derail this conversation completely, but I am,
No,
I
go
guess.
ahead.
That's a really cool way of thinking about it, I guess. It sounds actually really in line with a lot of what Benjamin says in Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, in the sense of like the reproduced image is something that kind of meets you halfway. You have to do the rest of the work, though. Huh. Neat.
I need to read Benjamin still. There's a book which I haven't read. I had it like saved on my reading list. I'm just gonna get the title up. But it's called Image, Icon, and Economy, and it's by a guy called Monzane, and I think he was a media studies guy. But it's about the iconoclast controversy and the kind of theologies there. So I haven't read that, but I guess if you're looking for good stuff to read on this kind of
always
media and icons, and that's probably your place to go.
No, that sounds neat. Yeah, I love like the metaphysics involved in images. That's so weird how we think through those things, but that's cool. Sorry, Dean, what were you gonna say?
Well, speaking of that, like aesthetic attention and how it just draws you into a different kind of life, I think that unwittingly my first connection with Orthodoxy actually came through this American nomadic American nomadic punk band called the Salters. And they have an album called The Divine Liturgy of the Wretched Exiles. And it's like, throughout it, they kind of very intentionally borrow from Orthodox liturgy and, reroute certain songs from Orthodoxy, but also from American labor traditions and that sort of thing. So, but it's very funny because they've built a real kind of aesthetic around that in an interesting way. I mean, I don't think that they're Orthodox, but they've found some like really powerful symbols within that tradition, which is really a cool thing, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. There's a zine called Death to the World, which I haven't read.
Oh yeah, I have some of those.
Yeah, that guy was at Cornerstone.
That was basically started by monks.
Right.
I've forgotten. It was begun as a kind of response to kind of punk and rock and roll counterculture like stuff, and it was by monks, I think, like actual monks, as opposed to just people who thought that was cool. But it's basically a kind of appealing to the kind of there is a very severe there's an ascetic tradition, which sometimes a very severe one is a kind of ascetic of kind of the holy man and kind of death to self, death to the world, and there was a whole thing about kind of drawing that and kind of punk ascetics into kind of correlation. That's a little interesting project that I always mean to look into more and kind of explore a bit, but.
Yeah, that's a really cool zine. Actually, he was that guy. I remember seeing him at Cornerstone like years ago. There was like a monk that was actually there, like selling their merch. Like they have.
That's cool.
I know they have like really cool T-shirts and they have zines and stuff. But yeah, it is all out of like that Orthodox tradition. It's really cool though.
Yeah,
it's such an easy thing to adapt to like hardcore music culture. It's the aesthetics overlap quite a bit.
Yeah, that's where I first learned about Father Seraphim Rose. That's just like a very funny thing. Like that's the only context that I ever would have heard of that guy.
Right. Oh yeah. Well, he's an interesting one. I mostly know of him rather than actually anything about him. But I haven't read him. But I know people. He's influential, interesting. The one downside to the kind of convergence between like kind of those aesthetics is that sometimes you get a very odd interaction between that and kind of white supremacist aesthetics that needs to be that deserves more attention than talking about. I mean, I think really the white supremacist appeal to Orthodoxy is, at least in the West, fairly superficial, but it is a thing, and I mean, I've spoken to people before, and they've said like, I remember I was chatting with a friend about tattoos, and I was saying I wouldn't know what I'd get, and they said like, what about like like what are those Orthodox crosses or something? And I remember thinking like, I can't get that in case someone thinks I'm a white supremacist.
That's too bad.
Yeah. Speaking of that aesthetic, even a little bit more. I remember there's this time that I visited the Unorthodox Church for the very first time. It was in college. We went on this trip. We went to a bunch of different churches. It was like this whole thing. That's neat. I remember afterwards, though, that like a lot of folks were really energized by that Orthodox trip, like that experience, because it was so foreign to us as a bunch of Protestants, for sure. And like the following weeks after that, I remember like a lot of my classmates were really interested in that theology and in like a kind of appropriative way. I wonder if you see any of that amongst people, especially, I think that's probably pretty prevalent on the internet, I guess, where people kind of claim lots of Orthodox ideas without participating in the community in any way. Do you see that like as appropriative in sort of like an Orientalist kind of way, I guess?
I have a mixed attitude to it.
Yeah.
On the one hand, I have a sympathy for it because that was kind of what I did for a long time before. I did that sort of thing for a long time, and I eventually realized that I kind of was becoming convinced by certain claims that I couldn't just accept one not actually being Orthodox. I kind of realized that like I would be being dishonest to myself if I didn't. So I have sympathy for it. At the same time, I think that there's a way of doing it in which you only engage superficially with the tradition. I think that's the danger. The danger is that you engage superficially, and so there's a tendency among all theologians, I think, to say that, oh, Protestants think this, or Catholics think this, or Orthodox think this, and what they mean is I think this. I don't mean to be flippant, but like if you're an Orthodox theologian, it's not necessarily unusual to write the Orthodox teach X, but actually like what you're saying may be more or less, maybe slightly controversial, or at least not unanimous. It's an interpretation in some sense, and there's a certain danger in which, in particular, ideas about rationality and reason are kind of taken up. So there's a very influential movement in Orthodox theology called Neopalamism, or they don't call themselves that, but Neopalamism, and it kind of there's a lot going on. One of the things they talk about is kind of the purest knowledge of God is apophatic. The West is over focused on reason. In the East, we focus more on kind of unknowing. Kind of know God, apophatic knowledge. And I think I really like Neopalamism. I think it's really interesting. I think it's can be quite simplistic though, and there's a problem when people engage superficially with various popular Neopalamite theologians. And then obviously you simplify that even more, and then it basically becomes kind of like slabs are less rational than Westerners.
Oh yeah, weird.
And I can segue this if you want. If you want a segue, I can segue this into what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, let's do it.
So that can be bad, and a kind of. But I think that there's a lot of problems in Russian theology that go back to the Petrine reforms, which were happening in the 18th century under Peter the Great. Peter the Great, basically, he soon after he took the throne, he went away on a big tour of Western Europe, and he realized that Western Europe was much more. He considered Western Europe to be much more advanced, and so he comes home, and he immediately starts implementing these reforms. The most famous of which is that like he bans beards. He makes the noblemen all shave their beards, and there's a lot of resistance. You go underground in an effort not to shave. But at a more serious level, this is the first attempt at modernization in Russia. And it also involves, Peter the Great recognizes that actually a lot of Western greatness comes from colonialism. And Russia never engages in colonialism in the New World. It's not really able to in that way. But you get attempted conquests in various parts of Asia, including wars against the Turks, against the Mongols, against Japan. And so what happens is that you get there's a racialization of class in Russia. By the time of the revolution, there's a racialization of class in which the aristocracy and the Tsar and whatever, even if they don't see themselves as Westerners, a lot of the ways they think of themselves have been forged through categories of colonialism. And a lot of the ways in which they talk about the peasantry, the workers, their subjects are, again, categories of colonialism. And so you get this racialization of the mob. And there's a way of talking about the Russian people as this kind of mass, this kind of Asiatic mass that needs a despot to rule it, and yet the despot and his class get to be refined and intellectual. So that's a fairly important factor, I think, for understanding the situation as you enter into the revolutionary periods that often doesn't get talked about.
Interesting insofar as it's kind of like it sets up a weird relationship between like the church and these kinds of reforming efforts, or what do you find like really important about that kind of connection?
The really important thing for the church is that as part of these reforms, Peter the Great deposed the Patriarch of Moscow, which I think is actually, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's uncanonical. I think that's against the canons of the church. But he deposed the Patriarch and replaced him with a synod, which is governed by a civil procurator. Procurator is a title taken from the Roman Republic, it's worth pointing out. But essentially, this reduced the church to a department of government. The church became like a department of government, and its role was restricted to spiritual education and the supervision of moral conduct. And that's in 1721. In the build-up towards the revolution, this actually becomes a big thing, to the point where there's a council in the first council. So there hadn't been. So when he deposed the patriarch, normally a council would be called by a patriarch, and so there is no council in Russia from 1721 until 1917. And in 1917, following the February Revolution. So it's interesting because the Tsarist, so there've been calls for council from the 1800s, but the Tsarist autocracy had always held it back. After the February Revolution, they immediately begin the process of beginning a council, and the provisional government disestablished the civil procurator on the same day the council begins. So on the exact same day the council begins, the church ceases to formally be a department of government in the same way. And you have, and then in October, so there were one of the debates they were having is whether they were going to restore the patriarchate or not. And there was lots and lots of back and forth on this. It was very controversial. But then in October, after the revolution, they rushed it through, and they reappointed the patriarch. And so you have a very odd situation in Russia in which the church government is under the Bolsheviks is actually extremely new, and people are negotiating their position even within the church right from the beginning.
Yeah, that's so interesting because the stereotype that you usually get of the church and Russian communism just in general is that, well, this is oil and water. They were always that way from the beginning. The communists hated Christians and Christians hated the communists, and that was it. Like, that's all there is to be said about it. And I think it's interesting to make that story more complicated than it usually seems to be.
Yeah, there's definitely a mutual distrust. And to be fair, this mutual distrust is justified in some sense, insofar as the Bolsheviks and many other revolutionary groups had always insisted that the revolution must be an atheist, and that they were an atheist party. And also insofar as, this is just one example, St. John of Kronstadt, who was a major, he wasn't a saint yet, but he was a very revered holy man in the Russian church in the immediately pre-revolutionary period. I think he died just before, but he was immediately pre-revolutionary. He had said, there's a quote in which he says he was very anti-revolutionary. He gave money towards the Black Hundreds, who were like a fascist group, very pro-Tsar. And he once said that the revolutionaries should be slaughtered like Moses slaughtered the rebels at Sinai. So, and he was very influential, and so there isn't and so he's not atypical. He's not the rule, but nor is he unusual, and so there is in some sense justification for mutual distrust. But that is a simplistic picture as well.
So yeah, of course that's kind of simplistic. That's just the way history and podcasts work. I mean, I guess we can't really dive directly into it, but that is kind of an illuminating picture that gives a little bit more breadth to the understanding of religion in the Russian Revolution, for sure. It's illuminating for me, at least. I mean, we had many episodes ago now, like a really brief conversation about Lenin and religion, but that gives a whole different understanding to that kind of conversation now.
Yeah, and that I really enjoyed that episode. But I think it's worth pointing out. I'm not gonna. I mean, that was really good covering in Lenin. I think fair on what Lenin said, but it's worth saying that what Lenin said about religion in his documents sometimes was manifested in odd ways and perhaps jarring ways in practice.
Yeah.
Right.
So, for example, I think part of the problem is that because they were an atheist party, the Bolsheviks didn't think they had to come up with a church policy, and partially because they also assumed that religion would immediately die away following the revolution. And so they hadn't planned for what they would for a church policy, and they hadn't planned for what would happen if it didn't. And so, for example, Lenin says absolute separation of church and state, which, to be fair, I think is good and correct. But the problem is that in Russia, the church's entire income was so the state gave massive subsidies to the church, and the state's land was guaranteed by the church, and part of the separation of church and state meant no exemption from state decrees for the church, which meant that when the state nationalized all property, that included church property, which basically meant that the entirety of the clergy, bishops down to parish priests, were left without any means of income. And so you have this, and so obviously there's attempts to resist the nationalization of that property, at which point obviously the state then doubles down on them. So I think that there are problems with the separation of church and state. Isn't wrong, but you have to say more than that if you're going to actually address the situation in Russia at the time of the revolution.
Yeah. It's always really fascinating to me how that specific liberal impulse plays out in America, and like actually how it is very similar to the way Lenin talks about it. That there's like some kind of confluence between those two things. Well, dang.
Well, I mean, I think like the Soviet Union, from the beginning, I think it's pretty clear that they had a very hard time figuring out what to do with religion, and they did have like some very brutal and I think very not liberating moments of repression against the church that was like totally unnecessary, and that's awful. I don't know, maybe we should do a whole podcast about that at some point or something, maybe not. But one thing that I am very interested in is these kinds of figures that were like orbiting both of these institutions, both the Orthodox Church and then also, the kind of burgeoning revolutionary government. And I mean, there are so many interesting characters to talk about. I had like a very brief intellectual hobby period of my life where I was just reading a bunch of them at night for no conceivable reason, much to the frustration of my MA supervisor. But I wonder if you could talk about some of these characters. Like, I mean, we've talked about them a bit on Twitter, but one that I think is really fascinating is Maria Skobtsova. Maybe you could just like introduce her, say what you think about her. I don't actually know a ton except that what I've like imbibed from, reading an article here or there.
Okay, so Maria Skobtsova, I need to double check the dates, but she was born some point in the 1800s, and she dies in Ravensbrück concentration camp in 1942, I think. She grew up in a kind of aristocratic household in St. Petersburg. She became an atheist when she was 15 and her father died. And she fell in with revolutionary groups. She became a member of the Socialist Revolutionaries Party, which is one of the left parties that wasn't Bolshevik, but was involved in agitation and organizing at the time of the revolution in the revolutionary period. And many SRs did eventually go over to the Bolsheviks when the Bolsheviks imposed party rule. She eventually, during the Civil War, she became mayor of a town in the Ukraine, during which time she was put on trial briefly by the Reds, but they left quite quickly, and then by the White Army. It's during the occupation by the Reds, I believe, in which she said that there's reference to her planning to assassinate Trotsky. But I think everybody at some point, every interesting figure who ever encountered Trotsky, I think, wanted to kill him at some point. So I don't think that's significant.
The Christians and atheists alike.
Yeah, everybody. I just think Trotsky was maybe not that great a guy to hang about with. Anyway, but the town was occupied by the White Army, and she was put on trial as a communist by the Whites. She got off because the judge was sympathetic. The judge had been one of her teachers in adult education at some point. And they eventually got married, and they fled the country. And she ends up in Paris, where and during her time as a mayor in the Ukraine, she had returned to Christianity. She'd returned to the church. That's while she's still a socialist revolutionary. And there's no record of her ever leaving the party, though I think probably when she arrived in Paris, its activities probably just kind of died. I don't think she was involved. But when she got to Paris, over time, she eventually realizes that her vocation is in the religious life, and her and her husband get divorced. Her and Daniel Skobstova get divorced, and she takes her birth name was Elizabeth. So she'd been Elizabeth Skobstova, married to Daniel Skobstov, but she becomes Mother Maria, after the Mother of God. And she ran houses for Russian immigrants, because Russian immigrants, there was basically no state provision for them. And often they were regularly put in mad houses, for example, because it was presumed they were insane when actually they were just traumatized and couldn't speak French. And so she went around those asylums and kind of got them released. She ran canteens and hostels and houses and that sort of thing. And then during the Nazi occupation, they began hiding Jews, and they were eventually caught forging baptism certificates for them, and sent her and various of her companions were sent to concentration camps where she died.
Wow.
Yeah, what a figure. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's one of those amazing lives in which kind of like you kind of span the whole course of kind of 20th century, various things happening in the 20th century. It's an interesting figure to interact with.
Yeah, I also can't think of I can't think of very many saints who are like directly involved in revolutionary governing, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. She definitely moves away from politics. I think the whole emigre does. Okay, there's a process over time in which the emigre theologians, it's slow, but by the 60s, the emigre theologians have moved away from politics and political reflection that had been previously very popular amongst theologians. And she's definitely involved in that in some sense. Her writings in Paris are more social than political, I'd say. They're more about how an individual relates to social problems than about the ordering of society. But it's interesting to me that she returned to the faith while a mayor. I don't think there's enough work done on that kind of precise point in her life. It's partially, I think, because we have very little written record of it. But that precise point in her life when she's doing the work of governing as a revolutionary, and also returning to the church and finding something in that process.
Yeah, I think that's what attracted me to biographies of people like her. It's like while she's thinking politically in this way, she's also thinking theologically in creative ways. It's what for a while I was really interested in these characters like Nikolai Berjayev and Sergei Bulgakov, because they all, prior to the revolution, had been kind of like toying around with what it might mean to be a leftist and a Christian, in sort of unusual ways for both of them.
Well, in different degrees. I mean, Badayev, I don't know if you can call Badayev on the left, but he's closer to the left than I think Bulgakov. Bulgakov, I think, properly characterized as a liberal. He was involved in the founding of the Cadet Party.
Right.
And it's interesting in that he was involved so he had been a Marxist, as had many, and he was involved in what's a quite famous journal called Veki, which in Russian means milestones or landmarks or signposts. And this journal was basically a journal of various members of the intelligentsia who rejected Christianity and turned to idealism, but most of them to Christianity. There were a few of them who weren't Christian, and there was one or two Jewish writers, but a return to idealism and Christianity. And that's largely a liberal movement, but equally you have, there's a guy called Gershenzon who writes in probably the most controversial sentence of the journal. He wrote, "So far from dreaming of union with the people, we ought to fear the people and bless this government, which with its prisons and bayonets still protects us from the people's fury." So, a lot of these strains, you kind of get this weird mix of liberals and reactionaries, and then people actually flirting with Marxism. And it can be quite difficult to exactly pin people down.
Okay, so far in this conversation, we've had a few different characters kind of come up out of Orthodoxy and leftism. Some that are a little bit more interesting to us, and some that are not. What do you think that the Orthodox Church or the Orthodox Christians that float more towards the left have something specific to say to us in this sort of like contemporary place that we're in?
I think yes. I think yes, and this kind of curves the question a little bit. I think yes, insofar as the situation we're in, and we're all living in the West. We're all living in places where the church hasn't been dominant. And so I think there's a way in which there's a lot of very fruitful Orthodox reflection on history and on, relates to what I was saying about materiality, actually. There's a lot of fruitful reflection on one's social obligations, one's obligations to history, and one's place in history, and how that relates to God, how that one relates to God in that I think can be much more fruitfully. I think those are very fruitful. I think they're especially fruitful in a context in which the church is no longer a dominant social force, by which I mean a reactionary, no longer a institute of the ruling class. And so in the West, I think there's a lot of fruitful material for a kind of how Christians can talk about the political problems in relation to God. That I think that, I do think Orthodox theologians have something to offer there. That some of those Orthodox theologians in Russia are quite difficult and quite ambivalent. I think they can be made much more fruitful in that situation.
Maybe we could just pose to you as we close, Jonathan, just a basic question of how do you think Orthodox Christians can contribute to like contemporary leftist struggles, and how do you think that contemporary leftists can actually be maybe somehow more like more evangelical towards Orthodox people who have a reasonably complicated relationship with the left?
Yeah. To address the second first, I would say that maybe leftists should listen to St. Paul's injunction in Corinthians, where he says that you should seek not to offend the weaker brother, which I mean a slightly tongue-in-cheek way, in which lots of Orthodox people are naturally uncomfortable with socialism, communism, and with particular figures, especially. Lenin more so than Stalin, actually. That's a different conversation for another day, maybe. But there's a discomfort there. And I think maybe when in conversations with Orthodox Christians bringing up those things, it shouldn't be assumed that these people are merely trying to smuggle in fascist propaganda or something like that. It should be assumed that they sincerely have trouble, and there should be effort made to kind of talk about those problems and why they happened, and perhaps why, even if to talk about why both the Bolsheviks' actions are understandable and why they were mistaken and how those mistakes happened, and honesty there. Which I think that, I mean, I'm not a Leninist, but I actually think that even if you're a Leninist, you can do that. I don't think you have to actually oppose the USSR or reject what Lenin says to do that. And at the level of what can Orthodox Christians do to contribute to the left, I mean, I would firstly say just to get involved, to actually do something, to turn up at organising meetings, to turn up at and to get involved in the struggles directly. And I think that actually can resolve a lot of theoretical questions that otherwise become very abstract.
Last week when we talked to Derek Ford, he said something kind of similar, actually, that you find that like when you meet with people face to face and like organizing meetings or whatever, He was talking about the People's Congress of Resistance, but when you meet with them face to face, you find that some of those things that should be very contentious are all of a sudden not if you're actually there with them. So I think it's a solid point to keep making forever.
Yeah, and I mean, that's my experience of left infighting as well, and that when you're online especially, things can seem very fraught, and in theoretical texts, but like in real life, the people I've organised have ranged from liberals to Leninists, you know, and anarchists and all sorts in between, and it's never really come up. So
that's like so funny, but I mean, I guess exactly the point of historical materialism. So that's cool.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Jonathan, for taking time out of your busy study abroad schedule to hang out with us and chat a little bit. This is a really good time, perfect for October.
Yeah, no worries, anytime.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. As always, you should follow us on Twitter at the Magnificast. You can follow us on Facebook. We also have a Facebook group called the Magnificast Basement. You can jump in there and see all of the LaCroix-related humor, because that's basically what it is. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. Leave us a review. We're kind of out of them, so if you want to get on that review train, now is the time.
In fairness, we recorded this one like back to back with the Derek episode, so people just didn't leave a review within like 2 days.
Yeah, I know. So like, why not? Yeah, also follow us on SoundCloud and all that good stuff. If you want to support the Magnificast financially, you can on Patreon. It's patreon.com/themagnificast. We greatly appreciate all of our friends who do give us a little bit of that sweet Das Capital on Patreon. That helps us out so much in paying for the few things this podcast costs us. So thanks for all of that. All right, thanks for listening.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.